Hello, everyone. So we thought we'd try and bring a little bit of Sandville House rusticness into the retreat, and we've got the roaring fire here beside us here in the men's community, which was lovingly banked up earlier by Stephen. So thank you, Stephen. So I was invited to tell a story on the theme of generosity, but in the spirit of abundance, I'm actually going to tell two stories, one of which is definitely true, and one of which may or may not be true. And these are stories which have in the past evoked for me a spirit of fearless, open-hearted generosity and a sense of what a life imbued with that fearless generosity would look like. In particular, there was, well, the first story is called The Spoilt Prince. And in particular, there's a rendition of this story. So this is the true story. And there's a rendition of this story, which was written by a travel writer in the 1800s. And it's rather a Victorian poetic account of the story. But this particular evocation of this story has in the past really inspired me. So I'll be drawing on that account in my telling of the story. So the story of the spoiled prince. So there was a son of a warrior king. He was a young prince. He lived many years ago, a long time ago, over 2,000 years ago, actually. He lived in a far off land, and he lived in a palace. He had a palace full of comforts and riches, and he ate the finest of foods. He dressed in the finest of clothing. He lay in the most comfortable of bed sheets. Like, he was uber rich. He was richer than those guys out of Succession. I don't know if any of you guys are watching that. But he was a good man. He was a good man, but he was spoiled. He had surrounded by beautiful music and arts, everything that the spoiled son of a warrior king could ask for and that could imagine. So Sir Arnold, the writer, evokes, I think, some of the opulence of his life quite well when he describes this prince's inner chambers, which actually, despite it being many years ago, he had actually seems to have had really good air conditioning and perfect mood lighting. On golden cloths outspread and silken beds, and heavy splendor of the purda's fringe, lifted to take only the loveliest in. Here, whether it was night or day, none knew, for always streamed that softened light, more bright than sunrise, but as tender as the eaves, and always breathed sweet airs, more joy-giving than morning's, but as cool as midnight's breath. And night and day lutes sighed, and night and day delicious foods were spread, and dewy fruits, sherbets new chilled with snows, and sweetmeats made of subtle daintiness, with sweet tree milk in its own ivory cup. And night and day served there a chosen band of dancing girls, cup-bearers and cymbalers, delicate dark-browed ministers of love, who fanned the sleeping eyes of the happy prince. And when he waked, led back his thoughts to bliss, with music whispering through the blooms, and charm of amorous songs and dreamy dances, linked by chime of ankle bells and wave of arms and silver vina strings, and so on and so on. I think you get the point. Pretty opulent. So he lived in this realm of beauty and absolutely just comfort. And the prince's father went to so much lengths to pamper him. He went to extreme lengths, so to shelter him from any of the defects and discomforts of ordinary of life that ordinary mere mortals, the king's servants would have had to experience. So even members of the prince's retinue would have been ruthlessly moved on if they showed any flaws. If one drooped in the lovely court, her dark glance dim, her feet faint in the dance, the guiltless criminal passed forth in exile from that paradise, lest he should see and suffer at her woe. Bright-eyed attendants watched to execute sentence on such as spake of the harsh world without, where aches and plagues were, tears and fears, and wail of mourners, and grim fume of pyres. 'Twas treason if a thread of silver strayed in tress of singing girl or dancer, and every dawn the dying rose was plucked, the dead leaves hid, all evil sights removed. So, I know he said thus. That's how the king, I'm getting affected by the Victorian writing. That's how the prince lived. Thus is how the prince lived. Totally cosseted, pampered. But he was as I said, he was a good man, and he was a young man. So like most young men, he had his own ideas about how his life should go. And one day he managed to break out of the gilded cage he'd been placed in, the gilded cage of the palace. And he broke out to take a proper look at the world outside, his cosseted world, and at the bustling, thriving town that supported all those comforts. And that was a total blast for him. So he experienced the riot of sounds and colour in the town's markets, the wonderful, unfettered flow of life. Of course, he also saw glimpses of suffering. He saw men and women bent over with old age, young and old alike, wrought with sickness. He saw people dying and bodies lying dead. He smelt the acrid stench of burning flesh from the cremation grounds. And these visions shocked him right to the core. O suffering world, O known and unknown of my common flesh, caught in this common net of death and woe and life which binds to both, I see, I feel the vastness of the agony of earth, the vainness of its joys, the mockery of all its best, the anguish of its worst. Since pleasures end in pain, and youth in age, and love in loss, and life in hateful death, and death in unknown lives, which will but yoke men to their wheel again to whirl the round. So he was deeply, deeply affected by the sudden realization of the suffering inherent in life. But of course, in case you haven't guessed it already, he saw a fourth vision. He saw a holy man walking peacefully through the heaving press of people, as if somehow removed from the ceaseless flow of sickness, old age, and death. And this spoke to his heart. This moved him in a positive way, just as the four sights had moved him to tears. This sight of the holy man, as truth seeker, spoke of his longing, spoke to this man's, the prince's longing to respond to the never-ending cycle of suffering that everyone that he loved and all mankind, he just realized, would have to endure. So this was a crucial moment for him now. He was outside of his comfortable existence. He'd seen what was really going on out there, and he had a choice to make. And similar to the choices we all have to make from time to time, when we see a need and we have a choice, a dilemma of whether we want to respond to that or whether we can come up with reasons as to why we can't quite right now. It's not a good time for us. Obviously, his dilemma was on a much bigger scale, or certainly it turned out that way. So he had a choice. He could just go back to the palace and turn away in horrified revulsion at this suffering. And nobody would have faulted him. Nobody would have said, "What are you at? Like, go back out there." In fact, they're more likely to fault him for embracing this suffering, for trying to do something about it. They would have expected him to just go back to the palace. So this was a really crucial moment in the prince's life, and I'm sure everyone's probably guessed by now that what he did was he chose to give, because obviously I'm talking about Siddhartha Gautama. And he chose to go forth from the comfortable life of the prince, and he chose to give of himself, give wholly. So he gave the best gift. He gave his whole life. He gave his heart, and he gave everything away. So let's see what Sir Arnold, how he evokes this. Excuse me. I lay aside those realms which wait the gleaming of my naked sword. My chariot shall not roll with bloody wheels from victory to victory, till earth wears the red record of my name. I choose to tread its paths with patient stainless feet, making its dust my bed, its loneliest waste my dwelling, and its meanest things my mates. Clad in no prouder garb than outcasts wear, fed with no meats save what the chariots will give of their will, sheltered by no more pomp than the dim cave lens or the jungle bush. This I will do, because the woeful cry of life and all flesh living cometh up into my ears, and all my soul is full of pity for the sickness of this world, which I will heal if healing may be found. Because I love my realm, because my heart beats with each throb of all the hearts that ache, known and unknown. These that are mine and those which shall be mine, 1,000,000,000 more saved by this sacrifice I offer now. O summoning stars, I come, O mournful earth. For thee and thine I lay aside my youth, my throne, my joys, my golden days, my nights. So I think what Sir Arnold, the Victorian poet who wrote this, does wonderfully here, and did for me when I first read it, was evoke a sense of the human man Siddhartha and the ache in his heart as he steps out of his life, as he makes this decision. So it wasn't preordained, it wasn't predestined. He made a decision to give, to go beyond his comforts, to go beyond his own small world and look altruistically towards the other, to what was outside his comfort zone, to give his entire life. And yeah, obviously that's what he did. He went for it. Sorry, I don't have another excerpt. So we know what happened next. The Buddha went on to attain enlightenment, and he went to spend his life teaching the Four Noble Truths: suffering, the cause of suffering, the release from suffering, and the path to lead to the pacification of suffering. So he did it. He saw a problem, and he said, right, I'm going to do something about that. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to give of myself. And brilliant, he succeeded. And that's one of the reasons we're here. It's a big reason. My second story, which may or may not be true, was inspired by my thinking about the life of the Buddha and aspects of generosity in that life, and how essentially his whole life is one of giving and generosity. This led me to reflect on the life of a more contemporary figure, Buddhist monk whose life and teaching has inspired me so much over the last 10 years. I'm going to be less quiet about this. I'm talking about Bhante Sangharakshita. So particularly during the solitary I did in the weeks running up to my ordination retreat last May, I was quite struck by the life of Bhante and the decision of generosity he made, which has led to us being here and led to me being in Adhisthana, where Bhante's remains lay, in Adhisthana waiting to be ordained. So I was reading his memoirs, and I was reading about the time he was in Kalimpong in India, and he'd been in India for about 20 years, give or take, and he had a really good setup for himself, and that was really coming true for me in his memoirs. But he gets an invitation from the UK to visit the UK, and he gets an invitation from the Buddhist society there, and certainly the Buddhist establishment there, and he goes and takes up the invitation to live there for 6 months and work with them. And while he's there, he sees a need. He sees that the Buddhist there is a hunger for Buddhism in England, in London, in Britain, and he sees that the Buddhist movement there is somewhat moribund, somewhat lacking a bit of energy, a bit of Bhante energy. So he spends about a year. He goes over 6 months, and because he's getting involved, he's getting stuck in, as is his wont, and he spends about a year and a half there and building connections and really trying to shake things up a bit and succeeding in doing that. And more people are coming to the classes that he's organizing and getting attracted to the energy of the man. And eventually it dawns on him, he talks about it in the memoirs, about how he's not really sure when and where the idea crystallized, but within some time in the second year, he realizes that his work now is in England. He has to leave his setup in Kalimpong, and in order to work for the good of Buddhism, it's England is where he needs to be. So he was working for Buddhism, for the good of Buddhism in India, and doing great work, doing amazing work with the people who've been recently mass converted to Buddhism. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people who converted to Buddhism in the previous 20 years. So he goes back to Kalimpong for one last farewell trip, and just to put his business in order, as it were, his life in order. And what struck me was this, reading through his itinerary, going through India and Kalimpong and greeting people, is that he had a really good setup there. So here's just a list of some of the people he's meeting in late 1996 when he goes back to Kalimpong to put his house in order and to hand things over to other people and say goodbye to his friends. So you've got Dr. D.M. Yogi, who's the former Chief Justice of the Nagpur High Court, Dalai Lama, Dr. Mehta, who's Gandhi's former physician and a mystic in his own right, Dhardo Rinpoche, an incarnate Lama, Kazai Lindup, who's a leading Indian politician he was in great stead with, a Mr. Das Gupta, who's head of the local branch of the Central Intelligence Bureau, and Yogi Chen, a hermit and proficient scholar. So this is just a random list of people that I picked out of the memoir of people he's meeting, having tea with, and is on first name or maybe more formal basis with. But he'll sit down and chat to these people and considers many of them friends. He says whether he was visiting with a friend called Terry at the time. He says whether Terry and I happened to be on our way to see Dhardo Rinpoche or Yogi Chen, or walking through the high street of Kalimpong, or investigating the Tibetan pavement stalls, we could not go more than a few yards without my bumping into or being accosted by someone I knew, or who at least knew me. So he was popular, and well liked, and had a good setup. And in the middle of this trip, he gets a letter. His post is redirected, and he gets a letter from the guys back in from the English Sangha Trust, one of the stalwarts of the Buddhist hierarchy. And they essentially say to him, listen, do you know what? Thanks, but no thanks. We don't want you back. And they trump up these charges against him, which come to nothing in the end. But essentially, this is the result of feathers being ruffled, that he's ruffled while he was back in England. He stepped on Theravadan toes by trying to bring in the Mahayana and trying to bring in more energy. And they're saying, listen, we don't want your kind here. We're quite happy having our academic discussions about Buddhism and whatnot. So this is a moment for him. He's back in Kalimpong, seeing everyone. It's an emotional trip for him as well. He's sad to say goodbye to his dear, beloved teachers like Dhardo Rinpoche and Yogi Chen. And he gets this letter, and essentially it's an out. It's them saying, listen, we don't want you. You can stay there. So he has an option here. This is a crucial moment for him where he could stay in Kalimpong, continue with his meditative life, his scholarly work, and his very energetic working for the Dharma on behalf of the New Buddhist movement, the mass conversions. So he decides to stay. Doesn't come back. He stays in Kalimpong. He never really was cut out for setting up a new Buddhist movement. Doesn't come back. He doesn't set up Triratna. He doesn't set up a first system of non-monastic ordination in the West. And his teachings, as brilliant as they are, remain known to only a very few people that are already moving in Buddhist circles. They don't reach all the people that they would have reached. A guy called Sangapala doesn't get ordained, so he doesn't come to Dublin to set up the Dublin Meditation Centre. Guys like Yanadara and Parvard, well, no one's ever heard of them. Rajashura spends his life in staid academia, trying to ignore the existential ache in his heart. Okay, so that's not what happened, actually. We know what happened. He does come back, and here's how he actually responded to the letter. When he gets the letter, this is he turns around to his friend Terry, and this is an account of what actually happens, what he says he's going to do. To this crucial moment where he could just go, do you know what, Terry, let's just stay here. This is great here. I love it here. So warm. But instead, this is what he does. He says, do you know what this means? I asked Terry when I'd finished reading the letter. It means a new Buddhist movement. The words sprang spontaneously from my lips. It was as if the trust letter, coming as it did like a flash of lightning, had suddenly revealed the possibilities that had hitherto been shrouded in darkness or perceived only dimly. Though I had long felt that the Buddhist movement in Britain must need a fresh impetus, and had even discussed the feasibility of my giving lectures and holding classes outside the orbit of the Buddhist Society, I had certainly never considered the possibility of my taking a step so radical as that of starting a new Buddhist movement, whether in Britain or anywhere else. But I now saw that a new Buddhist movement was what was really needed, and that the trust letter had opened the way to my starting it. The movement I was to found some months later may have been born in London, but it was conceived there in Kalimpong on the 24th of November 1966, at the moment when I addressed to Terry those 6 fateful words. It means a new Buddhist movement. Thank you.